Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's historical counterfactual is a big what-if about the Vietnam War. What if the United Nations had managed to end the war before it really got going? And why didn't they? Thant Myint-U is a historian, and he is also a former United Nations official, serving on, among other things, 3 peacekeeping missions. This, as you will hear, is a conversation about his grandfather, U Thant. We should probably begin this counterfactual with some background, including some background to the person who's going to play a central role both in the story of what really happened and our account of what could have happened, and that's your grandfather. So do you want to just say a bit about who he was, and in particular, how did he arrive at such an extraordinary position of at least potential influence in 1964?
So my grandfather was U Thant. He was born in Burma, which was then a province of the British Indian Empire in 1909. And he spent nearly all of his early life until he was 38, 39 years old, living in a very small town, about a day's river journey from the capital, Rangoon. He was from a relatively well-to-do family that became suddenly impoverished when he was a teenager. That forced him to leave university when he was, after just 2 years. And he had to give up his dreams of becoming a civil servant, and instead was a school teacher and then headmaster in this little town until, again, he was almost 40. And then when Burma became independent, he joined the new government. He rose very quickly. One of his old friends became the prime minister. He traveled the world with his prime minister. And in 1957, the prime minister, U Nu, offered him the job of ambassador to the UN. And so just 10 years after, or less than 10 years actually, after leaving that little town in Burma with no electricity, no running water, almost no one else who spoke English, he found himself in the middle of Midtown Manhattan and at the very center of this new global politics. And within 4 years of arriving in New York, he became the only human being in the world that was acceptable to both Washington and Moscow to be the Secretary General of the UN.
So there are many remarkable things about that story. One of them, which is relevant for what we're going to talk about, is it's not totally dissimilar to the story of the man on whom this counterfactual is going to depend, which is Lyndon Johnson. It's actually kind of remarkable. So people might not know about Lyndon Johnson, is that he was a school teacher. And actually he came from a family that, through a combination of bad luck and circumstance, was very poor, poorer than they had expected to be. He couldn't go to college. The only place he could afford to go to was teacher training college in Texas, a long way from the center of anything. And Lyndon Johnson, I think they were similar ages. They were born at roughly the same time.
Just a few months apart, yeah.
Just a few months apart. It's amazing. And Lyndon Johnson, the most powerful man in the world by 1964, and your grandfather, U Thant, is the head of the United Nations, not the most powerful man in the world, but the symbol of international governance and of global unity. These 2 school teachers from, in some ways, the back of beyond, who have, by their own efforts, made it to the center of things. Did they have any recognition that they had a similar story, do you think?
Yeah, I'm not sure when my grandfather knew this, but Lyndon Johnson had been informed of this. And so when they had their first sort of big meeting in August of 1964, when my grandfather flew down to Washington and was hosted by the president for a couple of days, Johnson discussed this with him, that they were born within a few months of each other, that they, as you said, had grown up in this small town and been school teachers, that they were married on exactly the same day in 1934, and then went into public service. And I think what Johnson probably didn't say was that they both achieved their high office on the back of the assassination of their immediate predecessors as well. So this strange parallel, 2 very different men, but parallel lives in some way.
And maybe we should just say a little bit about how that happened in your grandfather's case. So we're talking here about the death of Hammarskjöld. Remind people what happened there.
Yeah, so one of the big crises of the UN of its first 15 years was a crisis in the Congo. And that had made Hammarskjöld unpopular with the French and with the Soviets, who didn't want the UN to intervene in the Congo. But it also made the UN very unpopular with white supremacist networks that were operating in Katanga, which was a province that was in rebellion in the south of the Congo. And it's a complicated, very murky story, and we still don't have all the facts. But Hammarskjöld died in a plane crash in September of 1961. The UN was in crisis at that time. He was not on speaking terms with either Paris or Moscow. And his plane crashed in the middle of the night. And intelligence agencies, both in London and in Washington, still refuse to open their files. So it's a mysterious killing, and we're not really sure exactly who was behind it.
And of course, the other story that you're referring to is the assassination of President Kennedy that led to his Vice President Johnson becoming president. And you could say the same of that. I mean, we may still and may never be in possession of all of the facts. I think there's one more key bit of background here before we start talking about the Vietnam War. And this is something that I sort of feel, I don't know how I didn't know this, because I've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis and I've actually written about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I've read many conventional accounts, I suppose you would call them conventional Western accounts, which portray the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 as the most dangerous moment probably in the history of the world, and a sort of essence of high politics, high political brinkmanship, where in the end everything turned on communications between Washington and Moscow, some through Bobby Kennedy, the president's brother, the Russian ambassador, and so on. And the role of the United Nations in these accounts and of Thant is always treated as incidental. It's kind of window dressing. There was a sort of show happening at the UN, and the real business of getting the world out of this terrible peril was the eyeball-to-eyeball communications and Khrushchev sending an intemperate message and so on that was happening off stage. But I think there is another way of telling it, and actually, you persuaded me of this, which is that Thant's role was central.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the all-important background to this is also that, the UN was, to a large extent, not just a Western creation, but an American creation in 1945. By 1946, it was not what it was expected to be because of the Cold War. It was impossible to be the sort of policeman, great powers acting as a policeman of the world. And that concept that Roosevelt had been kind of cast aside. But by the 1950s and certainly by the early 1960s, the UN had been transformed. And it was transformed because of all of these new countries in Africa and Asia coming into the UN, making it their home, and changing the core DNA of the UN in a way that I think we don't appreciate often. And U Thant was, to some extent, an agent or a symbol of that transition. And so I think he was, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was just 9-10 months into his job as acting Secretary General at the time. And he was acting very much as this symbol of these neutralist countries, the Afro-Asians, as they called themselves. And the main thing that he did during the Cuban Missile Crisis was he managed very quickly, within 2-3 days of Kennedy's public speech on the 22nd of October, sort of position himself as that neutral intermediary that both sides could relate to and use in different ways. Because as you know, both for Kennedy and for Khrushchev, this was a political problem as much as a military problem. And they both needed ways to disengage from the problem. And in their very different ways, they used U Thant and the UN for that disengagement, for that climb down, for that de-escalation of the conflict. And U Thant also traveled to Havana to try to placate the third element in the crisis, which was Fidel Castro, who was Fidel Castro in Havana. And he managed to do this as well. And I think the trick in all this, or the key ingredient in all this, was having someone at the center who respected or showed respect to all sides and empathized with all sides, and then was the person to whom they could turn for some of the things that they had difficulty in doing directly with the other. Or to put it in simpler terms, I think for the Russians, for example, it was much easier to respond to a request from the UN Secretary General, who is from a non-aligned country, than it was to an ultimatum from the American president, for example.
And I was going to say the other term for that group of nations, the new nations within the UN, not all new nations, but who had joined more recently, was non-aligned in the Cold War world. The non-aligned grouping wanted to assert their ability to be neither one side nor the other. And as the representative of that, And I use that term window dressing in the sense it would normally be used as something pejorative. It was absolutely crucial that there was a kind of cover, and diplomacy is cover, right? I mean, it's one of the things that diplomacy is there to do, including the deal that was struck, which was that the American missiles would be taken out of Turkey. But the thing that had to happen behind the scenes, I think it is remarkable as well that he was the man who was sent to Cuba to confirm that the missile sites were being dismantled, or at least that he was confident enough that they would be dismantled. I mean, it's fairly remarkable to have the trust of the Russians, to have the trust of the Americans, and to be trusted in a way by both sides to give an honest account of what was actually happening in Cuba. And you've cited it. The tributes that were paid to him afterwards were glowing. At the time, if you were reading the New York Times, you wouldn't think that John F. Kennedy had saved the world. You would think your grandfather had saved the world.
And it was a fortuitous thing in a way, because I think if a European had been in that role, even a person from a neutral country like Sweden, his predecessor, Dag Hammarskjöld, he may not have been able to play the same role as an Afro-Asian, as they self-identified themselves at the time, from an online country. And for some, not related to Cuba because that was a sudden crisis, but related to the Congo and everything else. I mean, he had been trying for months at that point to cultivate a good personal relationship with both John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. So in July or August of 1962, he traveled to the Black Sea and he spent a couple of days with Khrushchev, sort of bonding and getting to know one another. And those personal relationships, that personal contact with both superpower leaders, put him in a very good place in October of 1962 when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke out.
And was his personal story part of this? So not only did he fit the mold in terms of who he was and the nations that he might represent, but he was the man from nowhere. I mean, what you described is someone who would have appeared on the New York stage, first of all, the UN based in New York. There he is, as you say, in Manhattan. But within a few years, he has the role at the head of the UN. But he doesn't really have a history. Is that part of it? I mean, most people by that stage of the Cold War, in one or other way, would be compromised by their history of getting to the top.
I think it's a mix of things, because on the one hand, I mean, I don't think he could have been appointed to that role, or he would have even been considered as a candidate if it hadn't been for the fact that Burma was a staunchly neutral country during the Cold War. And so coming from Burma and coming from a country that both the Americans and the Soviets wanted to have good relations with gave him a sort of step up. But I think in New York and as ambassador, he proved himself to many delegates from many countries and their governments as the man who could kind of get along with everyone. So even when he was the main advocate for the FLN in Algeria in 59-60, this is the French war in Algeria, and the FLN was the revolutionary movement that were fighting the French, he was able to push forward the FLN's agenda in New York and at the same time remain on good terms with the French ambassador. So I think he had proven sort of diplomatic skills. And in a way, even though he came from Burma and from this little town, I mean, British Burma was also a multicultural place and in some ways a cosmopolitan place. So I think he probably had certain skills that he may not have had if he had come from a place as isolated as maybe parts of Washington might have been at that time.
All of this is by way of explaining that, therefore, in 1964, he did have an awful lot of political capital.
Yes, absolutely, because he had already diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis, but also dealt with this white supremacist rebellion in the Congo, which we don't really remember very much, but was actually also not just a Cold War crisis, but a really important crisis to both the United States and also to these Afro-Asian countries as well.
And thereby he gave quite a lot of political capital to the UN, which hasn't always, then as now, had much political capital in the highest reaches of international politics. The crisis then that he thinks is coming, it's not fully formed yet, but he thinks in 1964 the thing that has to be headed off and becomes his priority is the looming prospect of a war in Vietnam. I mean, there has been a war in Vietnam, and we'll give a bit of background to that. But he also has a clear sense that there is a real danger of escalation of the conflict in Vietnam and the Americans being drawn in past the point where they can't get out. But I think we should sketch the background to this first. So if you can, quite briefly, before we get onto the forks of history, summarize as it were, how we arrive at the state of the conflict in Vietnam that he faces, that he sees as his big diplomatic challenge in 1964. Kennedy is dead. Johnson is now in the White House. But Johnson, at this point, we should say, has not been elected president. He is a vice president who's inherited the presidency. So there are questions about his, in some ways, he has less political capital than U Thant does. Give us the background to the state of the conflict in Vietnam at this point.
So what is today Vietnam, together with Laos and Cambodia, had been part of French Indochina. So they were French colonies from the late 19th century through the early 20th century. And the French tried to keep Vietnam French even after the Second World War. Vietnamese nationalist movement that was headed by communists, and in particular by this person Ho Chi Minh, who was the leader of these Vietnamese revolutionaries, fought the French and largely defeated the French, with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu being the kind of inflection point in that first war. And then there was a peace conference in Geneva that was attended by both the new Chinese Communist government, by the Soviets, by the Americans, as well as by the Vietnamese and the French. And it was decided then that Vietnam would be divided in two, but as a very temporary expedient, and was meant to lead to elections, I think, in about 18 months after the agreement was concluded. So the agreement was in 1954. I think elections were meant to happen in 1955 or 1956. But these elections never happened. And instead, America decided that it wanted to consolidate South Vietnam as an independent country and as a bulwark against what they perceived as communist aggression and the threat of communism coming down from the USSR and China into North Vietnam and then extending into South Vietnam. So they wanted to draw the line at the 17th parallel, which is a division of North and South Vietnam. And President Kennedy, in very early 1960s, began to send American military advisors to try to help this fledgling South Vietnamese regime. But by the time Lyndon Johnson became president, that South Vietnamese regime was doing extremely poorly in many different ways. The leader had been assassinated, overthrown in a military coup, and the South Vietnamese army was doing very badly against communist guerrillas known as the Vietcong, who were controlling more and more of the countryside at the time.
One of the things I think that's important here is we're talking about the Cold War. In many ways, we're talking about the height of the Cold War, but people tend to think of the Cold War as a binary contest. And certainly in relation to the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was a binary contest. The ultimate showdown was a showdown between two leaders. But a large part of the complexity of the situation in Vietnam is the role of China, and the fact that China and the Soviet Union were very far from being allies in this situation against the Americans. So there was deep American anxiety about what you might call broadly the spread of communism, and some paranoia as well. But there was specific concern about China. And also, presumably, this is still the Washington in which the question who lost China is rattling around higher government and diplomatic circles. You know, the phenomenon of the Chinese as a real communist power in this region is recent enough for people to remember and cast around blame for how they got there. How should we understand the three-way game of diplomatic chess that was going to have to be played if any peaceful resolution was going to be achieved?
I mean, in 1964, you began to have this disconnect between the two big communist powers. It was becoming more obvious even to people on the outside in a way that it hadn't been even a year or two earlier. I think for the Americans, there was also the experience in Korea and fighting the Chinese communists in Korea. So people would have seen parallels between the need to defend what was then South Korea, or what is still South Korea, and what was then South Vietnam. I think that all sort of was part of the American conceptualization of all of this as a situation where if one country fell to the communists, others would as well. So this is the domino theory as it was rolled out at the time. So in general, despite the fact that there were these differences between Moscow and Beijing, which would become much more acute over the next couple of years, people in Washington saw communism as a monolith and believed that Hanoi was part of that monolithic communism. Whereas in fact, at least by 1965, if not 1964, both Beijing or Peking at that time and Moscow were very, very concerned that they didn't seem the weaker supporter of this communist regime that was then increasingly under threat from the Americans. Or to put it another way, it was very difficult for the Soviets, even though in some ways they didn't want to see an escalation of the war in Vietnam, to do anything that would make themselves seem weaker in their support for Hanoi than the Chinese, who were moving in a much more radical direction.
So you could say in 1964, there are reasons to think it's going to be very difficult to resolve this situation because each side, and we're talking about three sides here, doesn't want to be seen to back down. But of course, that was the problem with the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is the problem of Cold War politics. The challenge is to find a way for the different sides to back down without being seen to back down. But there were, I think, also reasons to be optimistic that an agreement could be achieved here. And one of them is the one that you mentioned, which is the Americans didn't want another Korean War. I mean, I think we were still sufficiently near to the Korean War, which had been perceived by many Americans to be a disaster. It made Truman the most unpopular president in modern American history when he left office. His views of him have been revised now. But the Korean War was thought to have been a great expenditure of blood and treasure for very little return. And Americans could be reminded that there was a danger that something similar was going to happen here, an artificial division of a country, and then sunk costs leading to more costs, and at least potentially a rerun of that. And there was also the experience of a couple of years previously. The UN had helped to resolve an intractable problem. Would you say that U Thant had grounds for optimism that the UN could broker a peace here? If we're going to talk about the counterfactual, I think we have to try and persuade ourselves that there were forks in the road that could have been taken. It's not just brinkmanship meant that by this point neither side could back down. How would you characterize the grounds on which he believed that the UN could play a decisive role in bringing the different parties together? And of course, that also had to include the Vietcong and Ho Chi Minh.
I mean, it was absolutely not a situation where anyone wanted big escalation and anyone wanted what was to come in terms of, almost 10 more years of war and 1 million plus people dead. No one was thinking of that at the time. I think that from U Thant's perspective, he would have thought about a few things. I mean, first, from his position as UN Secretary General, first and foremost, I think he saw his responsibility as trying to dampen Cold War tensions and make sure there was nothing like the Cuban Missile Crisis again. And I think he was pleased to see that there had been some thawing in the relationship between Washington and Moscow, and he was very keen to push that forward. He believed that Khrushchev, who was still in charge in Moscow, was sincere in his desire for what was called peaceful coexistence at the time. President Kennedy in 1963 had given his speech at American University more or less saying the same thing, that he wanted better relations with the Soviet Union. And I think from U Thant's perspective, this meant not just better relations between the two superpowers, but every possibility that the two superpowers could then begin to work together at the UN on a whole range of other issues, from economic development for poor countries to exploration in outer space and cooperation there. And he felt that the Vietnam War, if there was an American war in Vietnam, that would jeopardize what looked like a real possibility for movement forward in the Cold War and better relations all around. So I think that was the first thing. I think the second thing is that he felt, I think this is from his Burma experience and perspective, that the thing that was driving or would be driving the Vietnamese more than anything else was nationalism. It was their desire to see the French out of the country. And from his experience with communists, he was an anti-communist in Burma, but with communists and other radicals in Burma, was that the one thing that would radicalize them further and make life more difficult for people in Vietnam was foreign intervention. And the less foreign intervention there was, the more likely there would be a better outcome for people in Vietnam. And lastly, I think he felt that there was still a way out that would preserve American prestige, that it wouldn't be an American defeat, but this was a political problem that could be worked out, and that some kind of peaceful unification of the country was possible. In the end, it might be a communist country, but I think his hope was that it would be a communist country like Yugoslavia that would be neutral, and so not a bother to anyone else. And he didn't believe that the domino theory was correct.
And the other thing that was true, as you mentioned, is that South Vietnam was a failing state at this point. It was corrupt. Its government was very unstable. It looked like at least potentially a kind of black hole into which resources might be sucked with not much return. So there is a strong incentive there for the Americans to think about the worst case scenario. So what then is the plan that he takes to Washington?
So he goes to Washington in August of 1964. Johnson had been president for more than half a year. He doesn't know this, but most of Johnson's advisors had been strongly advising Johnson to escalate the war imminently. He was there the week of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where there was a clash between American and Vietnamese Navy vessels off the coast of North Vietnam. And so the war was at an inflection point. But Johnson, I think, invited him down to win him over in a very Johnson way. He thought he could charm him, he could win him over. And at the very least, I don't think he was thinking like Kennedy had during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He wasn't thinking of Thant as a possible ally or someone he could use in a clever way. I think he just didn't want him to be a problem for him. That if he was going to escalate, he didn't want this UN Secretary General to criticize or get in the way in some way. So I think he was trying to win him over. But U Thant wouldn't have necessarily known that at the time. And instead, what U Thant said to Johnson and to the rest of his foreign policy team, Dean Rusk and Robert McNamara and McGeorge Bundy and all the rest, were three things. One was, if you go to war in Vietnam, you will not win. This is a political problem. This is not a military problem. There's no military solution. Secondly, the Vietnamese are nationalist. They don't like the Chinese. They don't want to be under Chinese domination. Domino theory is incorrect. And third, he said, what you need me for, perhaps, is to help you in putting together the kind of coalition government in South Vietnam that will be broadly representative and that will be part of allowing for you a graceful, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5-year exit from Vietnam that will lead to peaceful unification and that will leave American prestige intact. So that was the pitch that he was trying to make at that time.
And was he at the same time, or were people from the UN at the same time making a pitch to the Vietcong? Were they making a pitch in Moscow? Was it just initially Washington that was being made an offer here, or was there the beginnings of a real negotiation going on?
I mean, the extraordinary thing in this, I mean, it seems, well, maybe it doesn't seem strange from the outside, but, because China and North Vietnam and South Vietnam were not members of the UN, and for other reasons as well, the Vietnam issue wasn't on the agenda of the UN. So the Security Council hadn't taken it up. The General Assembly hadn't taken it up. And so U Thant was doing this on his own initiative. He was the first Secretary General that did something for which he had no mandate from any of the UN's other bodies. And so he was doing this on his own. So this was an initial attempt by him. He had started to make a couple of public statements warning against American escalation. But this was his first attempt at some sort of diplomacy with Washington. And I think he came away from those couple of days in Washington feeling like he had some kind of, if not green light, then yellow light from Washington. Johnson had thrown this enormous party for him at the White House. 300 people, Johnson told him. It was the biggest dinner he had thrown ever as president so far. And he invited several dozen senators and congressmen. He flew in 4 governors from around the country. He had Peter, Paul, and Mary come and sing Blowing in the Wind to the entire American foreign policy establishment on the eve of the escalation of the Vietnam War. So it was quite a moment, but U Thant came away from all these discussions in the White House and at the State Department thinking that he should try his hand and that he could reach out to the Vietnamese and the Soviets at that point.
I think Peter, Paul, and Mary singing Blowing in the Wind in the Washington of 1964 was window dressing. I don't think that was a cover for anything. But still, the offer is made. We mentioned that he and Johnson had this eerily parallel trajectory to that meeting, but they were very different kinds of men, weren't they? Do you have any sense of when they met, how they viewed each other? Because also, as you say, the people around Johnson, I think by this point he'd got rid of Curtis LeMay, whose answer to any question on any subject was bomb them. But nonetheless, the sort of Dean Rusks, the Robert McNamara's, and Kennedy's people, and Johnson didn't want to seem to be less tough than the tough men around Kennedy, not necessarily soldiers, some of them tough businessmen or administrators, but nonetheless, there was a hardening of attitude there. But if Johnson had taken a different view, things could have been different. Was there a connection between them? Or actually, do you think they were talking at cross purposes?
I don't. It's interesting because on the one hand, I mean, U Thant didn't come in for the kind of very aggressive treatment that Johnson meted out, not just to sort of colleagues and American politicians and subordinates, but even other foreign statesmen. I mean, he famously said to the Canadian Prime Minister Lester Pearson around the same time when Pearson came with some suggestions about what the Americans should do in Vietnam, he said, "Don't come and piss in my tent." And so he wasn't aggressive or even very assertive with U Thant. That could have been because he respected the office or he thought he wouldn't get very far if he did with U Thant. I'm not very sure. But the one thing that we do know is that, in the conversations for which we have transcripts, they do have this back and forth where Johnson is constantly questioning him for his opinion of different things. And this goes on for years, even when they don't have a good relationship and they have this big falling out over Vietnam. So I have a little bit of a sense that, Thant was, even when Johnson didn't like him because of his stand on Vietnam, he was one of the very few foreigners that he met all the time. And in a very political way, I think maybe he was trying to get from U Thant ideas that he might not have gotten or got, from others elsewhere. I think he was also being politically very savvy. I mean, in the sense that, he would, in many of these internal meetings, he would say, how is U Thant going to respond? And he often grouped, and this is much later, this is in 67, 68, he would group Thant together with Bobby Kennedy and the Pope as three people who could cause problems for him on Vietnam. So I think he had a sense of, what is very different than today, which was a degree of public support for the UN and the prestige of his office. But maybe as a direct answer to your question, I think they had a respectful and quite friendly and often quite amiable relationship in person that then soured, but that was a couple of years into the future because of Vietnam.
So now let's get to the potential fork in the road here. So there are two questions. One is the what if question, which I'm going to come to. What if this offer of a way forward without escalation had been taken up in Washington? But there's also the question about why it wasn't. And we've touched on some of the reasons: American paranoia, American sense of prestige, the domino theory. But after all, what they were being told was true. So first, you won't win this war. Maybe at that point, none of them understood it, but it turns out that was true. Second, you need a government in South Vietnam that is more stable than the one you've got. And that's going to require it actually to be more open to a range of different opinions. It's going to have to be something closer to a government that could negotiate some unification. Otherwise, you're just going to be propping up a rotten regime. Also true. It seems to me the third one is the hardest sell, which is if you go down the route of the original plan and we have elections and they lead to the reunification, it may well result in a communist-dominated government, but that government could still be neutral. Now, in the Washington of 1964, I don't know, but it seems to me it's going to be very hard to persuade the men around Johnson that was true. Do you think that was the sticking block? And he could point to the example of Burma, which was, as you say, a neutral country, but it wasn't a communist neutral country.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that in 1964, it was impossible for the men around Johnson to imagine that there couldn't be a military solution to this, or that the American military, if it put its mind to it and did everything it could, wouldn't be able to defeat an insurgency in South Vietnam or even deal with North Vietnam as well. So I think they always felt that there was a military option if they were willing to go down that route. But I think the second point, or the point that you just made about the real sticking point, which is the end goal, what is acceptable? And I think for the Vietnamese, for the North Vietnamese, there were some in North Vietnam already who believed that they could also win the war, and they wanted to go down that route. And they felt that there was no problem in turning to the Chinese and the Soviets and defeating any American intervention that came in. But there were still people in North Vietnam in 64, in a way that there weren't even a year or two later, who believed that a peaceful route, meaning peaceful unification, where the goal was the same of a unified Vietnam under Hanoi's leadership, but where the time frame could be longer, where it might take 5, 10, 15 years, where there might be a period where there was a still independent government in Saigon. As long as the Americans withdrew and as long as peaceful unification or unification was the end goal later on. So I think there were people who believed that. And so I think for U Thant, I think the sell that he had to make was that that end goal is okay. And there might have been the Burma example, but there was also the Yugoslavia example by that point as well. So I think he was trying to make the case that at the end of the day, whatever system there was, political system there was in Vietnam, it shouldn't matter to the outside world and it didn't have to be a threat. And the Vietnamese genuinely wanted to be neutral.
And there were people, I wouldn't say in Washington, but in this case in New York, Adlai Stevenson. I mean, there were people on the American side. Adlai Stevenson, the former presidential candidate, twice defeated, but now US ambassador to the UN, who was very close to U Thant and broadly supportive of this. I mean, there were plenty of people in the upper reaches of the American political establishment who were extremely wary of the route being gone down. Part of this feels like an accident or even a tragedy of timing, in the sense that it would have been very hard for Johnson to change the trajectory that had been put in place under Kennedy until he had won an election in his own right. He did win an election in his own right, one of the greatest landslides in American political history, at the end of 1964, and then is inaugurated in his own right in 1965. But escalation has happened by that point. The Americans have started bombing North Vietnam, and presumably once the bombs started falling, that thing that you just mentioned, which was there was an appetite on the North Vietnamese side to see a long game demilitarized solution here. We know what bombing does. It hardens resolve. It doesn't weaken resolve among the bombed. It hardens resolve. And this feels like a classic example of that. Johnson had the political capital by 65 to maybe go against what some of the people around him were advising. But by that point, it was much harder, in a way, for both sides to step back from military escalation.
And what had happened in the months in between? So he had met Johnson in August of 64. That was the White House meeting. He approached Ho Chi Minh indirectly through the Soviets, through a KGB connection. And within a couple of weeks had received information back that the Vietnamese were indeed interested in talking directly to the Americans. So he was proposing secret talks between Hanoi and Washington in a third country, perhaps in Rangoon in Burma. So the Vietnamese accepted, but there was no answer from the Americans. The election happened in November. There was still no answer. And it was only in January that the Americans finally answered no. And by that time, the Americans had already decided on the beginning of this bombing campaign. And as you say, David, I mean, once the bombing began, it was not just militarily ineffectual, but it added this additional complication, because for the Vietnamese from that point on, there could be no talks unless there was an unconditional halt to the bombing. And for Johnson and for the Americans, saying that there was an unconditional halt to the bombing became politically, or was politically, untenable for a very long time.
And do we know whether when the Americans said no, it was because Johnson had said no, or actually because the message was never relayed to Johnson? There were enough people who didn't think it was in anyone's interests to actually raise this real possibility of secret peace talks between the Americans and the North Vietnamese.
I think in early 64 and in the lead up to the Gulf of Tonkin and the beginning of bombing, Johnson's advisors, at a time when the president himself was very focused on domestic issues and very successfully focused on domestic issues, have been trying very hard to convince him that escalation, the bombing, the introduction of American combat troops into South Vietnam was the way to go. And I think people like Dean Rusk, who knew of U Thant's outreach to Hanoi, didn't want anything to complicate the picture at a time when they were trying to keep Johnson on this narrow path to escalation. So I think from the information that we have, from the archives that we have, from everything else, it seems that Johnson himself did not know until very late in this period. And he didn't know until probably late in January, early February of 1965.
Now I want to ask what might have happened. It seems to me it's a stretch, but by the terms of historical counterfactuals, it's not actually a huge stretch. Some of this looks structural. The challenges are really difficult to extricate the rival powers, superpowers in this case, from this conflict. But there were strong incentives for them to get out. No one wanted an escalation. The Americans believed in their own military supremacy, and yet they already had experience, including in Korea, that it wasn't always what it seemed. It's at least possible to imagine a set of scenarios, maybe including a slightly different way of communicating via the men around him with the president himself, that those peace talks did take place. We've got to, as it were, overcome two barriers here. First of all, we've got to get to the peace talks, and then the peace talks have to produce a workable agreement. say we had got to the peace talks, say secret peace talks had taken place in Rangoon, do you think there was the basis of a workable deal that could have come out of that? You'd have to bypass people like Dean Rusk. So we have to get past the barriers of the accidents of the men who called the shots or prevented the president from hearing the news. But if we do bypass them, do you think there was the basis at that point for a workable peace? Or do you think it would probably have broken down anyway?
I think it would still have been difficult, but not impossible. I mean, for the reason that you mentioned before, right? Because the end goal was still so different for the two sides. And unless the Americans were willing to shift a little bit in terms of what the end goal could be in the way that the French would shift or shifted in Algeria, say, a few years back, I think those talks could have broken down at some point. I mean, we would have gotten in late 1964, if they had listened to U Thant at that time, we would have gotten in late 1964 to the point that was not reached until May of 1968, when they finally did sit down together in Paris. It was still a huge uphill struggle at that point, but hundreds of thousands of people had been killed. America's standing in many countries had been lowered. America itself was incredibly divided. And on both sides, there was a lot of emotion and feeling that wasn't really there in 64 yet. And so it's possible that if they had sat down in 64, there would have been a better context, a better environment for discussion. But the Americans still would have needed to move to the point where they were willing to accept some kind of neutral Vietnam and some kind of face-saving exit, even at the risk of having that neutral Vietnam be a communist country.
By 1968, the other thing that had happened was a presidency had been destroyed by this. Johnson's presidency was destroyed. So American politics had moved to a completely different phase. We were by then in the looming era of Henry Kissinger, but also party politics and the way that the Republicans saw this issue as something that had to be used in order to get back into the White House. None of that held. I mean, it was the case post the Kennedy assassination until, say, year 2 of the Johnson administration in his own right. The president had an extraordinary cachet with American public opinion. So that was the window. Do you think it's also true that with hindsight, Ho Chi Minh himself and the Vietcong, they have a reputation for a kind of intransigence, are willing to outlast the other side, and inflexibility. These were the people who were going to grind down the Americans. But actually, they were pragmatists themselves in some respects. They weren't the blinkered ideologues that they might sometimes be presented at, nor the sort of ruthless guerrilla force that was just determined to sort of win a war of attrition. In 64, on that side at least, wasn't there more openness to a range of possibilities?
Yes, I mean, because I think even the Chinese, who are often blamed as the kind of most radical element in all of this, were not that radical on this specific issue. They didn't want a situation where they could come into direct conflict with the Americans again, like Korea. The Soviets certainly wanted a negotiated compromise if possible. And so if talks had begun, it's very possible that, yes, the Viet Cong might have done better in South Vietnam over the following year, 2 years. It's possible the Americans might have been forced to listen to U Thant's advice at that point and help to set up a broad coalition government. It's possible that in a few years' time, the American advisors would have had to leave and there would have been some unification. But that's no worse than what happened. And in many ways, it's much, much better. And what would have happened would be, in terms of American history, it would have been completely different. I mean, Johnson would almost certainly, if he had not gone into Vietnam in 1965 the way he had, would have probably had a second term, in which case he would have consolidated his Great Society project. We wouldn't have had Richard Nixon. We wouldn't have had Watergate. I mean, the whole trajectory of American history would have been changed in world history as well.
And you could say it's probably overstating it a bit, but if you couch it in those terms, the intransigent ones, the ideologues in 1964 were the Americans. I mean, the Americans would say, we're not the ideologues, we're pragmatic, democratic politicians. Robert McNamara is a businessman who just looks at the numbers and works out what works and so on. But actually, the real intransigence was on that side, not least because of a sense of, a real sense that the single most valuable commodity in high superpower politics is prestige. And that's the one thing you can't afford to squander. And yet, of course, what the Vietnam War did was on a scale that would have horrified them, squander American prestige. And, on this what if, it would have changed the course of American history. It would also have changed the course of the Cold War. What do you think it would have done to Soviet-China relations, or at least that three-way balance of power? Had there been a relatively stable, relatively neutral, but essentially communist Vietnam, how would it have shaped the self-understanding of the communist world?
I'm not sure what it would have done to sort of Moscow-Peking relations, at least over those few years in the mid-1960s. They might have deteriorated anyway. They still might have competed in other ways for the closest possible relations with Hanoi. But Hanoi would have just been that much less important. I mean, it was so important for them to be backing the number one war in the world against the Americans. It would otherwise have not been that important to back just another socialist state in the third world. I think that Soviet foreign policy also moved under Brezhnev and Kosygin by 1965 into a much more hardline direction because of Vietnam. It was directly because of the American escalation, the bombing, the introduction of ground troops, that the Soviets also took a much harder line position vis-a-vis Washington as well. I think going back to what you were saying before, I think, on the one hand, there were the Cold War calculations and the feeling that American prestige might be on the line. But I think in addition to that, I think there were good faith, sort of feelings on the part of people like Dean Rusk that this was not just a case of communist aggression, but I think they really felt that free peoples needed to be protected. I mean, at the end of the day, there was a lot of repression in North Vietnam. There's certainly a lot of repression in communist China. So I think in addition to Cold War calculations, there were genuine kind of ideological and other feelings about the need for America to stand up for societies that had not yet fallen to the communists as well. And I think there was an echo chamber there in Washington around that issue that was very difficult for anyone to penetrate.
And yet it was an example of the, I think, familiar paradox of that ideology. Free peoples need to be defended. The south of Vietnam, those are the free peoples. But those people, if they had real freedom, did not back the government that was being propped up by the Americans because they had seen through it as a kind of sham in a way. And the other version of what it would be to endorse the freedom of that people would have been to hold those elections.
And the missing factor in all of this, which is that, in the US, it would have been seen as communist versus anti-communist. And I think going back to what we were saying at the very beginning, I think what Thant and others were trying to emphasize all along is that nationalism is also a big element in this. And it can be framed as much as a nationalist versus foreign conflict. And, this is later in 1967, he gave a speech to 3,000 Quakers in North Carolina. And he compared the Vietnam War to the American War of Independence to try to get the Americans to kind of understand what was happening. And he said, just like in the American War of Independence, it's possible that a majority of people are not supportive in many ways, but that doesn't mean that strength of feeling is not there within that political movement that is going to continue at all costs. So I think he was also trying to frame it in a different way. But I think on the American side, there was a complete discounting of that nationalist impulse against foreign intervention that was there in Vietnam.
Exactly. And people will be able to think of other American wars that didn't turn out so well, where the basic problem was the people whose freedom was being upheld didn't want the Americans there in the first place. There is also an alternative history here, which is the history of the UN, because, as we said, UN prestige under your grandfather at this point was pretty high. I think a lot of people think of the UN they have many different views of the UN as an organization, but its ability to broker peace in the most difficult trouble spots of the world is not something that most people associate with it. It might come up to clean up afterwards. It might be involved in these things and actually get deeply compromised by its involvement. But the idea that the UN would be at the very, very highest level, at Cuban Missile Crisis level of negotiation, the honest broker of a way out, it felt like that was a real thing in 62, 63, 64, but not really much after. Actually, probably from this point on, as you say, the relations between U Thant and the Johnson administration really break down effectively, don't they? Because he comes to be seen as a critic of the escalation of the war. Say that peace had been brokered and had held, not perfectly, but had held. Would we have a different UN now?
I don't know what would have happened over very recent decades. It's a very long time, but possibly, and certainly, in the late 60s, 70s, maybe onwards as well. I mean, the Americans chose U Thant partly because they saw him as a moderate third world person. And this is the kind of person they wanted to work with at a time when they were worried about radicals in the third world, as it was called at that time. And, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Kennedy administration, the early Johnson administration worked with him on a whole range of other issues, Yemen, Cyprus, Papua New Guinea, very happily and with some success. I think the turning point really was February of 65, when he did a press conference and he said that the American people are not being told the truth about this war. And Johnson, who didn't know very much about what had been happening in the run-up to that statement in terms of his attempted secret talks with Hanoi, was furious. And from that point on, I think that relationship turned. Another way to say that is that, in the 5, 6, 7 years before that, before 1965, the UN was in this very special moment where you had this generation of leaders in the third world, Nehru, Nkrumah, Nasser, others, who really embraced the UN and wanted it to work. And at the same time, you still had a Washington that was committed to its project. And so you had this overlap, this alignment of the stars that didn't last. And the shift of the Americans away from the UN, I think, began when they began to see U Thant as someone who was opposed to them on their core national security issue. And in a way, his success was that he was able to stay in office, be elected or appointed to another term, politically survive, despite the fact that he stood up to the Americans or challenged the Americans, not just for a few months, but for several years on what was their most important national security issue.
Did he make any other efforts to broker a peace? I mean, during that period, I don't think there's another fork in the road moment comparable to 64, but did he have another go?
Yeah, so I think for the next several years, until the Nixon administration came into office, I mean, he felt incredibly, not just pressured, but I think this was his obsession. He said that this was his obsession to try to find a way forward in terms of peace in Vietnam. And so he then began to actively meet with the North Vietnamese. He worked with the French who supported him very actively, partly because they knew it would rile up the Americans. But all of that really came to very little until 68. And in 68, when Johnson decided he wasn't going to run again for the presidency and was open finally to direct talks in this bombing pause, he was brought in again to help find a location for the talks, which was then Paris in 1968. But more importantly, over those same 3 years, what he was doing it was not so much the diplomacy, which again was not very successful. It was that he used his office and whatever prestige he had and whatever political capital he had, he spent it on constantly advocating for a halt to the American bombing and for finding a peaceful way forward in Vietnam. And so I think he was a very central part of that, not just the anti-war movement in the United States, but internationally, and placing the United Nations on the side of those who wanted a peaceful resolution of the war. And so I think that was a political achievement that went beyond whatever diplomatic achievements he might have had in relation to that over those following years.
One of the remarkable things about his story is it spans that decade, essentially the 60s into the early 70s, a decade in which a lot changed, including, as you said, it was the growth of a new kind of, I guess you could call it internationalism, which was much more, partly because of Vietnam, an anti-war internationalism. There was always an anti-war internationalism around the use of nuclear weapons, but this becomes something else, and he became a symbol of it. And one way to characterize this is 2 songs. So you have, in 1964, Peter, Paul and Mary singing Blowing in the Wind, and as it were, Dean Rusk singing along, pretending that he believes in that sentiment. Just tell the story about your grandfather's retirement party and the song that was sung there.
So in end of 1971, he was already a very controversial figure because of Vietnam, but also because of his role in the Middle East, in Biafra, in the Bangladesh war. There were many other conflicts in which he had been brought in, but with nothing like the American support that had been there in the earlier part of his tenure. In December 1971, when he was about to retire, a retirement party was organized for him by a group called the World Federalists, which have now more or less disappeared from history, but included very, very big names at the time. And it was a party of 600 people at the Pierre Hotel in New York. It included people like Nelson Rockefeller, Jacques Cousteau, Thor Heyerdahl, the Norwegian explorer, Buckminster Fuller, Arnold Toynbee, all these people was part of this World Federalist movement. They sent messages. Jackie Kennedy was a sponsor. So it was this strange kind of amalgam of late 1960s, early 1970s celebrities and political leaders. And two of the people who came, or three of the people who came, were Pete Seeger, the musician, and John Lennon and Yoko Ono. And Pete Seeger was supposed to perform the music. He did. He played Jacob's Ladder and Turn, Turn, Turn. And then at one point, John Lennon passed him a note, and Pete Seeger passed John Lennon his guitar. And John Lennon said, I'm going to sing a song. I haven't performed it before in America. And he sang Imagine for the first time in the United States. And that was at the closing, or near the closing, of my grandfather's retirement party.
Thant Myint-U is writing a book about his grandfather, U Thant. We will let you know when it's out. It is going to be a fascinating read. It's going to be called Peacemaker. If you'd like to sign up to PPF Plus, just go to ppfideas.com and you will find our shiny new website with a lot more besides. And we have a brand new bonus episode out on PPF Plus now. It's to go with our political fiction series, and it is a companion to our recent bonus episode on Philip Roth's The Plot Against America. This one is about Michel Houellebecq's shocking, outrageous, but weirdly interesting counterfactual novel, Submission. We're about to take a break, and while we're away, we are going to be re-releasing the whole of our political fiction series. That is 15 episodes, one a day, every day, starting this evening with Shakespeare's Coriolanus. You may have heard some of these before. My hope is that when we put them all together, they do make, as well as a lot of different stories, one single story about the history of people writing about and thinking about politics through fiction. If you know people who haven't heard it, but you think they might like it as holiday listening, do please tell them about it. One a day, every day, starting this evening. And we will be back in September for more historical counterfactuals, the great what-ifs. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.